She ruined my Christmas with a joke. It happened right in the middle of dinner. The table was set, lights glowing, people smiling. Elaine laughed a little too loudly and said something you don't say. She didn't accuse. She didn't explain. She joked. A short, crooked sentence, tossed out as if she didn't expect a response. And inside that sentence was the secret they had hidden from me for years. I felt it before I understood it. The laughter died midair. Forks froze. No one corrected her. No one laughed. The whole house held its breath. In that heavy silence, I thought for 1 second that I might be overreacting. Just 1 second. Then it clicked. When everyone goes quiet at the same time, it's because everyone knows. I looked at her face. The color drained. A micro-expression of panic slipped out before the smile returned. It was tiny, but I saw it. Years of performance betrayed by the body in a detail no one commented on. She tried to fix it too fast. It was just a joke, she said, explaining without being asked. She talked too much. People who fear the truth tend to keep talking. Then an old memory came back, sharp and sudden. A forgotten sentence. A poorly explained incident. Everything snapped into place at once, as if my brain had been waiting for permission to connect the dots. It was Christmas. They thought the date would protect the secret. Lights don't stop shadows. When someone who hadn't even been mentioned defended themselves a little too loudly, I knew it inside. I didn't need confirmation. The pain wasn't discovering it. It was realizing how long they had been lying. At that table, the power shifted. I chose to stay silent. After that sentence, no one was spontaneous again that night. The conversations continued, but in a mechanical way, as if someone had turned the volume down on the house. I stayed seated with my napkin folded on my lap, feeling the weight of something that didn't yet have a name, but was already taking up too much space inside me. For a moment, I wondered if I was being too sensitive. That thought came quickly, almost automatically. I'd spent years training myself to think that way. But it didn't last. Something in my body told me this wasn't exaggeration. It was delayed recognition. I had always tried to be the easy one in that family, the one who smooths things over, who laughs to avoid awkwardness, who makes jokes to keep the whole table functioning. I thought that was my role. Today I knew it was just the most polite way of not being inconvenient. The silence after the joke wasn't surprising. It only confirmed something my body had been registering for a long time. Strange pauses when I entered the room. Conversations that shifted topics. Decisions made before I arrived. For years, they said it was my age, my sensitivity. They repeated it so often I almost accepted it as truth. Elaine had always been the most careful with me, always concerned, always over-explaining what I might forget, what I might not be understanding correctly. I accepted it, not out of naivete, but out of exhaustion. Questioning takes energy, and I spent a long time using mine to keep everything in order. That night, something slipped out of her control. The joke wasn't aggressive. It was too intimate, too revealing. Only someone who knows the truth speaks that way without realizing it. I watched the others. Robert didn't look at me once after that. Daniel fiddled with his phone for no reason, his fingers tense. Susan smiled at me with eyes full of pity, and that hurt more than any spoken confirmation. That's when I understood something difficult to accept. What I lacked wasn't information, it was permission. Permission to trust what I had been feeling for years, to accept that it wasn't distraction or exaggeration or fragility. It was planned exclusion, silent, collective. Christmas was always sold as unity. That night it became a stage, a beautiful setting holding up something fragile, lights, glasses, rehearsed laughter. All to protect something that had been broken long before I noticed. I didn't cry. I didn't confront anyone. I just observed, Because I learned, late, but I learned, when the truth starts to surface, reacting too fast can be a mistake. And I needed to understand how far that lie went and who it was protecting. In the early hours of that Christmas morning, I didn't sleep, not from anxiety, but from activity. My mind moved quietly, like someone reorganizing a house after a wall collapses. I wasn't replaying scenes with exaggerated emotion. I was reviewing. For a moment, I even wondered if I was looking for a problem where there wasn't one. That thought appeared weak, almost tired. It faded quickly, because what came after it was stronger. Coherence. An old sentence came back in full. Years earlier, Elaine had commented on when everything was decided. At the time, I didn't ask what or when. I smiled. Now that sentence carried weight. It wasn't an offhand remark. It was a reference to something concrete. I got up while it was still dark and went to the kitchen. The house felt suspended. I opened a drawer where I kept old papers, things I'd never quite had the courage to throw away. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for. I only knew I needed to look with different eyes. I found a yellowed envelope. Inside was a copy of a document I vaguely remembered signing. I hadn't read it at the time. I trusted. Now, reading it carefully, I noticed the detail that had once gone unnoticed. A discreet paragraph. A choice of words that was far too careful. Consent obtained without real explanation. My body reacted before anger did. A heat rose in my chest. It wasn't fury. It was clarity. That joke hadn't been an isolated mistake. It was a slip from someone who had grown too accustomed to hiding. Other memories began to line up. Conversations cut short when I entered. Meetings scheduled at times I couldn't attend. Decisions already settled when I asked for my opinion. Always justified with care, as if they were sparing me. The hardest part wasn't recognizing the manipulation. It was understanding that I had been trained, little by little, to accept less, to hear less, to ask less, all done with calm voices, gentle phrases, smiles that said, "It's for your own good." That morning, I didn't cry. I organized, sorted papers, wrote down dates, not to accuse anyone yet, but to confirm something for myself. I wasn't imagining it. When the house began to wake up, I had already made a simple decision. I wouldn't confront anyone anytime soon. Whoever speaks too early loses leverage. Whoever observes learns where the lie is weakest. I sat again in the same spot as the night before. The tree was still lit. The lights blinked as if nothing had happened. But I knew something had changed permanently. That joke didn't open a new wound. It simply tore off the bandage from something that had been infected for years. The next morning, no one mentioned the joke. Breakfast was served too early, as if everyone wanted to get through the day before it really began. Cups touched saucers with exaggerated care, forced politeness. I watched everything in silence, trying not to overinterpret, and failing, because now everything carried weight. For a moment, I wondered if it was just passing awkwardness. Families go through strange moments. But that idea didn't hold. The atmosphere wasn't merely uncomfortable. It was watchful. Elaine avoided being alone with me. There was always someone nearby, a question thrown across the room, a useless comment about the weather, anything to fill the space. It wasn't affection, it was control. And that confirmed more than any confession ever could. When we were finally face to face, she touched my arm and asked if I was okay. Her voice was too sweet, too deliberate. I said yes, looking straight into her eyes. I saw a brief flash of relief cross her face, followed by stiffness. She needed to measure how far I had gone internally. Not long after, I noticed something small but revealing. An envelope that always sat on the shelf was gone. It hadn't mattered before. Now it did. People with nothing to hide don't move objects the day after tension appears. Robert commented, pretending to read the newspaper. that certain things had been settled a long time ago. He said it without looking at me. The sentence hung in the air like something rehearsed. Settled by whom? For whom? He didn't wait for an answer. None of them expected me to ask questions anymore. Susan caught me in the hallway. She opened her mouth as if she was about to say something important, then closed it, said only that Christmas had been intense. Her eyes apologized without asking for forgiveness. That hurt more than any direct accusation. In that moment, I saw the tired complicity of someone who knows and chooses to survive the silence. It wasn't an isolated secret. It was a system, a sequence of small decisions made without me, always justified as care, as age, as my supposed fragility. And the more I observed, the more clearly I saw the pattern repeating with unsettling precision. That afternoon, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't ask anything. Questions alert people. Silence confuses them. Those who believe they're in control tend to make mistakes once they think the danger has passed. While they talked about future plans, I listened from somewhere else. Every word now revealed something. Not because of what they said, but because of the effort it took to keep everything under control. That's when I understood. The joke wasn't the beginning. It was the leak. The first thread pulled from something that had been stitched together for years. And I wasn't going to look away anymore. Up until that Christmas, I had always found a way to explain everything. It was almost a talent. I turned discomfort into misunderstanding, exclusion into oversight, silence into respect. For years, I preferred to doubt myself rather than accept that people close to me were capable of erasing me so naturally. After the joke, something began to shift inside me. It wasn't anger, it was clarity. Still fragile, still being tested, but present. There was a moment that afternoon when I almost backtracked. I wondered if I was exaggerating, if it was just accumulated exhaustion. That thought came quickly, as it always did. But this time, it didn't hold, because it no longer matched what I was seeing. I remembered an old episode that had always felt confusing. A day when I arrived late to an important conversation. They said it wasn't worth bothering me anymore, that they had already resolved it. At the time, I accepted it without question. Now that memory took on a different shape. It wasn't care. It was a decision made without me. As I thought about that, I saw Elaine do something small, almost invisible. She picked up a stack of papers from the side table and took them to the bedroom, closing the door right after. It hadn't been a secret before. Now it was movement. People who don't fear the truth don't quietly reorganize documents. She passed me in the hallway and commented, smiling, that it was good I didn't worry about certain things. The sentence was delivered sweetly, but it carried a clear boundary. It wasn't advice, it was containment. I smiled back. On the outside, inside, that sentence sealed something in me. I watched Daniel from a distance. He avoided being alone with me, not out of contempt, out of guilt. Guilt shows itself in slumped shoulders, in the rush to change the subject, in the relief when someone else enters the room. Guilt has its own language, and I finally understood it. That was when I stopped asking myself if I was imagining things. The excess wasn't in my reaction. It was in their effort to maintain normalcy. Normalcy requires ease, and nothing there was easy anymore. That night, lying in bed, I thought about how many times I had accepted less to avoid conflict. How many times I stayed quiet to preserve a peace that was never mine. For a moment, I felt sadness for myself, not shame, a respectful sadness. And then something firm settled in. Not as revolt, but as a quiet decision. I would no longer make myself smaller to fit into convenient versions of me. Now I knew, and that changed everything. The next day, the house no longer functioned the same way. Not because anything had been said, but because something had been noticed. There was an excessive care in everyone's movements. as if they were all walking on a floor that could give way with one wrong step. For a moment, I considered that it might just be the emotional aftermath of Christmas. Special dates make people strange. But that idea fell apart quickly. The atmosphere wasn't sensitivity, it was restraint. Susan suffered the most with this. She never had the ability to sustain silence for long. She tried to compensate by offering coffee when my cup was already full, asking if I needed something I clearly didn't. It wasn't kindness. It was guilt, looking for an outlet. When we were alone in the kitchen, she took a deep breath like someone about to say something important. She didn't. She only said that I looked tired. The word carried too much weight to be casual. It was a test, an indirect way of measuring how far I'd gone. I said I was fine. Susan looked away too quickly. Innocent people don't avoid the gaze of someone who says they're fine. Not long after, I walked into the living room and a conversation stopped abruptly. It wasn't paranoia, it was their old habit. Elaine ended the sentence with a quick smile, the kind used to shut down dangerous topics. Her body didn't follow, though. Rigid shoulders, shallow breathing, vigilance. I began to watch Daniel more closely. He avoided deep conversations with me. When our eyes met, there was something that wasn't simple embarrassment. It was fear. Fear of making a mistake. Fear of saying something outside the agreed script. No one carries that without knowing more than they should. That's when I understood something essential. The secret wasn't only in what had been done. It was in the daily maintenance of the lie. In the constant effort to adjust words, control encounters, decide who could know what. That required organization, planning. The lie had a routine. While they tried to keep everything as it had always been, I was changing inside. I didn't argue. I didn't confront. I just recorded, repeated phrases, explanations that sounded too similar, schedules that kept repeating. Collective lies grow lazy over time. Susan tried to get close again late that afternoon. She said families are complicated. A vague sentence, said more to ease her own conscience than to help me. I simply nodded. I didn't give her the comfort of early forgiveness. Those who choose silence also choose its weight. That night, I understood something that changed everything. I wasn't alone in the discovery. They knew that I knew. They just weren't sure how much. And that uncertainty weakened them. That's when the game truly shifted. Because when someone spends their life believing you are fragile, but realizes you are lucid and quiet, fear changes sides. I could feel it in the air of the house, a new discomfort, a different vigilance. They were no longer watching me out of care. They were watching out of fear. On the third day after Christmas, Elaine lost her rhythm. It wasn't a collapse. It was excess. Care that was too deliberate for someone who claimed to have nothing to hide. She began including me in conversations in an artificial way. Asked for my opinion when the decision had already been made. Used my name more than usual, as if she needed to remind herself that I was there. That wasn't closeness. It was damage control. For a moment, I almost interpreted it as an attempt at repair. Almost. But her body didn't match her words. There was haste, vigilance, a constant calculation in her eyes. People acting out of guilt seek reconciliation. People acting out of fear seek control. Robert, on the other hand, shrank. He spoke less. Avoided crossing paths with me in the hallways. A man who had always occupied space began moving as if asking permission. His omission, once comfortable, now carried weight. Daniel made a small mistake, and a definitive one. He commented on something I had never been informed about, nothing alarming at first glance. But when he realized what he'd said, he corrected himself too quickly. The silence that followed was dense. He didn't look at me. He didn't need to. The rushed correction spoke for him. That was when I understood the scale of what they were hiding. It wasn't an isolated detail. It was an entire structure built on my absence. And structures like that only hold as long as the excluded person accepts the assigned place. I began asking simple questions, not accusations, practical things, times, names, dates, questions that shouldn't create tension for people telling the truth. The answers came clipped, sometimes contradictory. Elaine spoke too fast. Robert avoided responding. Daniel deflected. Each reaction was different, and they all pointed to the same thing. Shared lies are never perfectly coordinated. That night, I heard a muffled argument behind a closed door. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't need to. The tone said everything. It wasn't a fight over affection. It was a dispute over control. And I was the new variable in that old balance. I sat on the bed, listening to the voices bleed through the wall. For a moment, I wondered if I should intervene, if I should appear. The thought didn't last. I knew that wasn't my role anymore. For the first time, the discomfort wasn't only mine. I didn't need to push. The mistake would come. It always does. People who underestimate someone for too long eventually get careless. And I was there, attentive, whole, waiting. On the fourth day after Christmas, I heard something that wasn't meant for me. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a shout. It was a sentence said in the wrong place, with too much confidence, to the wrong person. And those are always the most dangerous. Susan was on the phone in the outdoor area. The door was half open. Her voice was too low to be careless, too loud to be safe. I wasn't listening. I was just passing by. And I heard my name. She said it was hard to keep things the way they were, that I was more attentive, that Elaine was nervous because if I decided to go after that, it would cause problems for everyone. That. The word landed like weight, short, vague, used only when the speaker knows exactly what it refers to, and is sure the listener does too. For a brief moment, I wondered if I had misunderstood. It was quick. My body didn't allow the doubt to grow. Susan noticed my presence too late. She turned abruptly, ended the call, as if trying to erase a sentence already spoken, smiled, a crooked smile, said it was work. I didn't confront her. I didn't need to. The truth had already crossed the space between us. In that moment, the secret stopped being a feeling and gained shape. Not in details yet, but in the certainty that there was something specific, contained, hidden from me. Something that, if I went after it, would shift the balance of that family. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the bed, took a deep breath. Not to calm down, I was calm enough. I breathed to organize. Truths that surface without warning require care. Fast reactions usually benefit the liars. I remembered an old conversation with Elaine years earlier when she said some things were better left as they were. At the time, it sounded like advice. Now it sounded like a warning. Warnings aren't given to people who have a choice. I began to understand the fear spreading through the house. It wasn't just fear of me finding out. It was fear of me acting, of looking for documents, asking questions outside the family circle, bringing someone from the outside in. Their panic didn't come from the truth itself, but from the consequences of that truth existing beyond that controlled environment. The rest of the day unfolded with rehearsed normalcy. I helped in the kitchen, commented on the weather, laughed when expected. Inside, though, I was already somewhere else, a place where old memories needed to be reviewed methodically. I watched Elaine watching me. She tried to appear calm, but her body betrayed her. Tense shoulders, shallow breathing. She knew something had slipped. She just didn't know what. That night, while everyone slept, I began building a timeline inside my head. Approximate dates, sudden changes, avoided conversations. What once felt like noise now organized itself into pattern. I still didn't know exactly what they had done, but I knew 3 essential things. It wasn't small, it wasn't recent, and it hadn't been done by accident. And for the first time since the joke, I felt something new. Not pain, not anger, determination. Because when the truth starts leaking through the wrong corners of the house, it's a sign that the silence protecting it is tired. And tired silences eventually speak. The next day, I woke up with a strange feeling that something had already been decided. Not by them, by me. It wasn't action yet. It was positioning, a quiet adjustment, like when the body finally finds its center after years of compensating. I spent the morning revisiting memories I had always avoided, not the painful ones, the confusing ones, the kind that didn't hurt at the time but left subtle marks. A document signed too quickly, a change of plans without explanation, a conversation cut short because it wasn't the right moment. For a long time, I accepted those things as normal. For a moment, I asked myself if I wasn't being too harsh in reinterpreting the past, if I wasn't being unfair. The thought came weakly, almost out of habit. It didn't last, because it didn't explain their behavior now, or the fear. I sat alone in the living room and let the name surface, not out loud, inside. There are words that change everything once they're finally accepted. Control, exclusion, management of my life without my presence. The impact of those words didn't come as shock. It came as an uncomfortable relief. Relief because it finally made sense. The pain wasn't only in what they might have done, it was in the time. The years between their first move and that Christmas. Years in which I smiled, trusted, over-explained myself. Years in which I made myself smaller to fit into the space they decided was enough for me. Daniel passed through the room and tried to start a casual conversation. I responded politely. He sat on the edge of the chair, like someone who didn't feel entitled to take up space. For the first time, I saw his conflict without romanticizing it. He had chosen the most comfortable side. Now he lived with the weight of that choice. Susan brought me a tea I hadn't asked for, set it on the table and said I was strong. Stronger than the tone she used. That word wasn't praise, it was excuse. People say you're strong when they don't want to offer repair. Elaine kept her distance. She watched from afar. Spoke to me only when necessary. When she did, she measured every syllable, not to care for me, to avoid damage. That confirmed everything I needed to know. It was there, in that quiet living room, that the secrets stopped being something they hid and became something I carried consciously. Named, recognized, integrated. Not as an open wound, but as strategic information. I no longer needed external confirmation. Their behavior over the years was already proof. The joke had only broken the final seal. I took a deep breath and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Authority over my own story. Not to confront yet, to choose the right moment, because truths discovered too early can be crushed. Truths sustained with calm gain weight, and for the first time, that weight was on my side. After the secret took shape inside me, something unexpected happened. The guilt began to dissolve. Not all at once, in layers, as if I were peeling away one by one the phrases that had been said to me for years and that I had accepted as truth. You're too sensitive. This isn't that serious. You're misunderstanding. For a long time, those lines worked. Not because they were true, but because I was too tired to challenge them. Now they sounded hollow. I started noticing how Elaine chose her words when she spoke to me. Before, she spoke with confident ease. Now she revised each sentence halfway through. It wasn't respect. It was fear of making a mistake. People who lose control of the narrative begin to trip over their own caution. Robert tried to restore an artificial normalcy. He told stories from the past, as if rewriting memories in real time. Carefully selected anecdotes, told for convenience. I listened in silence. For a moment, I almost felt the urge to correct him. Almost. But I had learned that fixing the story too early only prevents the lie from revealing itself on its own. Daniel began watching me with uncomfortable attention. It was no longer indifference. It was anticipation. He wanted to know if I would confront them, if I would make a scene, if I would explode. When he realized I wouldn't do any of that, he grew even more unsettled. People who avoid conflict don't know how to deal with someone who chooses timing. It was in that interval, in that active silence, that I noticed the shift in power. Before, they spoke. I adjusted. Now I observed. They adjusted. I started asking neutral questions, nothing accusatory, simple things. When was it that this changed? Who decided that? Was I part of that conversation? The answers came fractured, sometimes contradictory. Elaine responded too quickly. Robert avoided responding. Daniel deflected. Each reacted differently, and that said everything. Truths tend to be coherent. Coordinated lies rarely are. There was a moment when Elaine lost her patience for just a second. Just one. She said I was stirring up unnecessary things. The word hung in the air. Unnecessary for whom? It wasn't an attack. It was a slip. And I saw it. For a moment, I wondered if I should pull back, if I was pushing too hard. The thought appeared briefly, almost polite, then passed. Because pulling back had always been the movement expected of me, and I was no longer in that place. I replied only that I was trying to better understand my own history. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It wasn't awkwardness. It was alert. Because understanding your own history is the first step toward reclaiming it. That day, I confirmed something essential. The secret only survived because I had been placed in the role of the problem. As long as I accepted that role, everything worked. The moment I stopped accepting it, the structure began to creak. They still didn't know how far I had gone, what I had already connected, what internal decisions I had already made. And that ignorance protected me, because people who believe the other person is confused act carelessly. And those who realize too late that the other person is lucid tend to make mistakes. I knew. The mistake was close. The mistake didn't come as a confession. It came as carelessness. It always does when someone believes they still control the board. It was Robert who made it. In what seemed like a casual conversation, while commenting on old bills and necessary decisions, he mentioned something that shouldn't have existed. He talked about a specific meeting, an encounter where, according to him, everyone agreed. He used that word with far too much ease. Everyone. I asked, with absolute calm, where that meeting had taken place. He answered without thinking, gave the location, gave the year. Only then did he realize. The silence that formed was immediate. Elaine looked away. Daniel froze. No one corrected him. No one finished the sentence. I wasn't at that meeting. I never had been. And they all knew it. For a brief moment, I wondered if I might be mixing up dates. The thought surfaced almost automatically, like an old defense. It died quickly. The reaction was far too clear to allow doubt. Robert tried to fix it, said maybe I had arrived late or left early. Fragile explanations assembled in a rush. Elaine tried to change the subject. Daniel stood up, saying he needed to take a phone call. Each reacted differently, and that confirmed everything. There it was, living proof of exclusion. Not on paper yet, but in a shared memory that didn't include me. Families remember together when the truth is shared. When a lie is coordinated, everyone remembers it differently. I spent the rest of the day in deliberate silence. I didn't ask more questions. I didn't observe openly. I gave them the false sense that the moment had passed. Guilty people need to believe that to lower their guard. That night, Elaine knocked on my bedroom door. She came in without waiting for an answer, sat on the edge of the chair and asked if everything was okay. The question wasn't about me, it was about the damage. I said I was tired. She nodded too quickly. Relief. There's always relief when they think you've given up. But I hadn't given up. I had moved forward. That night, while the house slept, I did something simple and final. I separated emotion from fact. Emotions can be discredited. Facts cannot. Now I knew exactly what I needed to look for, which period to review, which decisions to question, where the truth had left formal marks. Their secret had a backbone, dates, meetings, agreements. It was no longer a vague feeling. It was a concrete sequence. And most importantly, I wasn't alone in this anymore. They had made the classic mistake of people who underestimate someone for too long. They thought I wouldn't notice a detail too small to matter. But small details are what hold truth together. At that point, I no longer needed to ask if something was wrong. I needed to decide when I would expose it. After Robert's mistake, something inside me organized itself with almost cold precision. It wasn't indifference, it was focus. When the truth stops being suspicion and becomes structure, emotion changes function. It stops shouting and starts holding weight. In the days that followed, I remembered more than I observed. Not like someone reliving pain, but like someone reconstructing a past. Each memory now found a possible place. Old conversations gained context. Situations that had always felt strange stopped being noise and became pattern. For a moment, I caught myself thinking that maybe I was going too far, that it might be better to leave everything as it was and move on. The thought appeared quickly and left just as fast, because moving on had always meant moving on alone. I remembered when they asked me to sign something without worrying. They said it was just a formality, that I didn't need to understand the details. I agreed because trusting felt simpler than doubting the people who sat with me at the table every Sunday. Today, that simplicity had another name. I decided to leave the house for a few hours. I said only that I needed to walk. Elaine asked where I was going. The question wasn't curiosity, it was surveillance. I said I needed air. She didn't insist, but her body betrayed the tension. She needed to know if I would talk to someone, if I would seek help outside that controlled territory. I walked without direction. Not to think too much, but to feel my body present. For years, I had lived as if I needed permission to take up space. Walking alone that afternoon was a simple and deeply liberating gesture. I didn't owe explanations. I sat on a bench and finally let the question surface without fear. Why did they do this to me? Not as accusation, but as analysis. The answer came clean, even if harsh, because they could, because I was convenient, because my lack of confrontation had been interpreted as permanent authorization. The years hurt more than the act itself. It hurt to realize how long I had lived adjusting my size so as not to disturb. I allowed myself to feel that without hurry, without guilt. Grief can be quiet too. When I returned home, the atmosphere was different. Elaine tried to seem casual. Robert avoided conversation. Daniel didn't look at me. Susan asked if I was okay. I said yes. For the first time, it was true. Not because I was comfortable, but because I was whole. That night, I opened my computer and organized old files. I didn't yet know exactly what I would find, but I knew what to look for. Dates, names, repeated terms, gaps. It wasn't impulse, it was consequence. As I organized, I realized something essential. They believed the danger lay in emotional confrontation, in the scene, in the outburst. They hadn't noticed that the real risk had always been something else. Organized information, active memory, someone willing to review the past with clarity. I closed the computer in the early hours and went to sleep with a feeling I had never known before. It wasn't relief, it was alignment, as if after a long time living bent to fit, I was finally occupying the exact space of my own body. They still believed they controlled the situation, but they no longer controlled me. and that had no return. I didn't announce anything. I didn't threaten. I didn't call a dramatic meeting. What I did was simpler, and precisely because of that, impossible to neutralize. That morning I sat at the table as usual. Coffee served, newspapers open, careful conversations. They thought it would be just another day of quiet containment. A day where avoiding certain topics would be enough until I got tired. But I wasn't tired anymore. I placed a thin folder on the table. I didn't slam it down. I didn't push it forward. I simply set it there, between the sugar and the butter. The gesture was small, but the reaction was immediate. Elaine stopped mid-sentence. Robert closed the newspaper far too slowly. Daniel looked up like someone recognizing danger too late. I said only, "I need you to explain this." Nothing more. Inside the folder were copies. Old documents, signed, dated. Technical terms that years ago I had been told weren't important. An agreement built in layers, with language carefully designed to look like protection. Consent obtained without real explanation. For a brief moment, a very brief one, I wondered if that would be enough. If they would try to minimize everything again. The thought passed quickly, because this time there was paper, and paper doesn't stay quiet. Elaine tried to take control, said everything had been done with my best interest in mind. The phrase came out automatically, rehearsed. But faced with documents, it lost force. Words don't compete with records. Robert spoke little. He admitted he thought it was the best path, that he didn't want to overburden me. He said it while looking at the table, not at me. People who know they're wrong don't hold eye contact. Daniel tried to justify himself, said he was young, that he trusted the older ones, that he didn't think it was that serious. His sentence was the most revealing of all. I didn't think it was that serious. As if my autonomy were an administrative detail. Susan cried, not out of surprise, out of relief. Relief from no longer having to carry the silence alone. Her crying didn't move me, not out of coldness, but because it came too late. I listened to everything. I didn't interrupt. I let them talk. People who over-explain eventually expose themselves. When silence returned, it was different from all the others. It wasn't complicity. It was exposure. Then I said the second and last important thing of that day. This isn't an emotional conversation. It's a review of decisions made without me, and I'm going to correct that. I explained calmly that I had already sought professional guidance. I didn't give names. I didn't need to. I said those decisions could be revisited, that there were legal paths, that I had the right to reassess everything that had been done in my name. That was when fear appeared. Not as panic, as calculation. Elaine realized it first. Her body stiffened. She understood the game had changed in nature. This was no longer about calming me down. It was about real consequences. Robert asked what I wanted. His voice was low, respectful, for the first time. That hit me in a strange way. Years trying to be heard, and now they asked because they had no alternative. I answered with the simplest truth. I want my right to decide back. Nothing more. I didn't apologize. I didn't threaten to cut ties. I didn't make a scene. I removed their control over the narrative. That was the justice. I explained that some things couldn't be undone. Time doesn't go back. But others would be reviewed, adjusted, corrected, with or without their support. When I stood up from the table, no one argued. No one tried to stop me. The power was no longer there. It had changed places without noise. I went upstairs with a heavy and good feeling. Not euphoria, dignity. From the living room, I heard chairs being pulled back. People taking deep breaths, each one dealing with the weight of their own role. That day, I didn't win a war. I reclaimed my place in the world, and it didn't require shouting. The days that followed weren't loud. They were careful, as if the entire house were relearning how to exist after something heavy had finally been put in its proper place. Elaine changed her tone. It wasn't sudden kindness or an explicit apology. It was real caution. Her words became measured, not to guide me, but to avoid exposing herself. For the first time, she seemed aware that I could see, and that changed everything. Robert made a few discreet attempts to reconnect, practical comments. Simple questions, nothing emotional. It was his way of acknowledging the new balance without having to name it. Men like him understand shifts in hierarchy even when they can't talk about them. Daniel pulled away, not out of indifference, but out of shame. His shame didn't bring me satisfaction. It brought clarity. He had been part of the system, but also a product of it. That didn't absolve him. It just explained him. Not all harm comes from direct cruelty. Some comes from organized cowardice. Susan came to me one quiet afternoon. She apologized without a speech, said only that she should have spoken sooner. I listened. I accepted it. Not to erase the past, but to stop living trapped in it. Forgiveness in that moment wasn't kindness. It was practical liberation. I began reorganizing small parts of my routine, schedules, commitments, papers, simple decisions that once felt too big. Autonomy returned in details. And details, when added together, build a different life. Some conversations never happened. Others remained unfinished. And that didn't unsettle me. Not all justice comes with full reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives in something quieter, delayed respect. There were moments of sadness, not for what was lost materially, but for time. For the years I could have lived with more clarity if I had trusted what I felt sooner. I allowed myself to feel that without rush, without drama. Grief can be contained too. The following Christmas was different, simpler, fewer people, less effort, less performance, and curiously, more truth. Not because everything was resolved, but because no one pretended normalcy where it no longer existed. I sat at the table and noticed something I hadn't felt in a long time. I was fully there, not as a function, not as a convenient presence, as a person. And that changed the taste of everything. Today, when I think about that Christmas, I don't remember the joke first. I remember the silence, the exact moment when something inside me woke up after years of being kept asleep for someone else's convenience. The joke didn't destroy my family. That's important to say. What it did was remove the last support from something that had already been broken for a long time. It didn't create the lie. It simply left the lie without shelter. I kept living. There was no cinematic restart, no sudden transformation. The change was quieter, and precisely because of that, deeper. I began trusting my own judgment without asking permission, respecting discomfort instead of silencing it, explaining myself less. Some relationships grew more distant, others gained a late honesty. None returned to exactly what they had been before. And that doesn't make me sad. Relationships that only survive at the cost of my shrinking never deserved comfortable continuity. I learned something I wish I had learned sooner. Imposed silence is not peace, it's control. And many women of my generation were taught to confuse the two. We were educated to keep the table set, even as our place at it was slowly reduced. Today, when I sit at the table, I am whole. Not because someone allowed it, but because I decided I would never again accept less than that. If there's one thing that night left me with, it's a simple and powerful certainty. It's never too late to reclaim your own voice. Never too late to revisit the past with more respect for yourself. Never too late to interrupt silent pacts that never truly included us. I laughed on the outside that Christmas, but inside something died, and it was the lie. In its place, something far more solid remained: dignity. If this story found you at a sensitive point, I invite you not to hold it alone. Here in the comments, you're not alone. If you want, share the moment you realized you were being silenced. Someone will recognize themselves in you. Sometimes, telling the story is the first act of justice we give ourselves.